All right. After a nice pregame at Tiki Taco, here we are.
Hello.
For all of these non-Kansas City natives saying, what the heck's Tiki Taco?
I feel like they probably could assume.
It's the most classic taco place of all time.
The most classic.
They've got a great bartender.
They do have a great bartender.
We had a great time with our bartender.
Who met his old teacher who got a drink
bar.
from him, which is very exciting. Yeah, but we are back after over a month, I believe, since our last episode, which I feel like it was kind of needed for this book. There was a lot going on for 100 Years of Solitude, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. Just to get back up to speed, we're going to go around the circle and talk about some media we've consumed since the last episode. And since this is Danny's episode, we'll go ahead and start with her.
I'm still listening to My Favorite Murder. I've said that
Boom
every time.
But that means every episode.
I also recently re-downloaded 99% Invisible with Roman Mars. Oh man, I love that. Have you guys heard of that podcast?
Mm-mm.
I've heard of it, but I've never.
I haven't even heard of it.
I really like it. It's like a design podcast where they just talk about like just all aspects of the very specific like aspects of the world, and like the like one of the episodes was about why park benches and like public spaces are designed like kind of uncomfortably so that like homeless people don't typically like try to post up there. Yeah. That kind of thing. So it's design, but it's just like design and architecture and like human interests like all rolled into one. And I listened to it pretty religiously when I was in grad school, and then I kind of just fell off the wagon. But I recently re-downloaded it, and they had a really great episode about how it was like a crossover almost with another podcast called Reply All, which I also love. And they did an episode about how 99% Invisible wouldn't play on like that. You like plug your phone into your car, and it like wouldn't play on this one person's like very specific like model of his car and in his radio. And so they like did a lot of digging and tried to figure out like why that particular 99% Invisible is the only podcast that wouldn't play. So they did, that kind of thing where they just like they investigate very specific, I don't know, they're not issues or problems, they're
mysteries.
Just like, I don't know, they're just like, why are things designed the way that they are?
Niche mysteries.
And I also really like it because it's digestible. They're like 20 minutes 25 minutes, and so like they're short topics or small topics, but I like to listen to a few just like on my way to work. So I've been listening to that. Also watched Abducted in Plain Sight.
Yes, we talked about that on our way back from Tiki Taco.
What an infuriating documentary.
Just baffling. The thing that we hadn't said to you is Jamie and I, when we were talking to each other after watching it last weekend, we were just like, I cannot believe that this family was okay getting interviewed. Like all of them just were like, yeah, let's tell our story.
Yeah.
Well, it made a little more sense to me because they were used to media because she had a book.
Right.
Yeah. But still,
like some of their decisions of just casually being like, yeah.
Well, and the information that they would have, that they agreed to have to share.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Also, like, just at one point, the dad, after sharing all of these things, made a comment of like, we weren't perfect parents. And we made a lot of bad choices, but I think we made some good choices too. And I was like, did you? How can you say that after all of the things that you just recounted? Like,
should we summarize it real fast?
Just the girl got kidnapped twice.
She gets kidnapped
by her neighbor.
By her neighbor,
a family friend. Multiple times, and the parents just like keep letting it happen.
And also, like, it's a study in like the screwed up like just justice system at the time, especially like in the 70s. Like, they did, they decided not to press charges, but there were so many times when he had kidnapped their daughter and was like calling them on the phone while their daughter was kidnapped, and she was like elsewhere, had run away. He knew where she was, and he would like call her mom and be like, "Hey, Marianne, what's up?"
And she would just casually
be like, "Oh, I'm not great, Bob.
Not doing great."
And they're just
have you seen our daughter?
so many
no, I don't think
layers.
so. Oh, I'm feeling pretty upset about it.
Just so many layers. Like the mom and him had an affair. He and the dad had an affair.
Yeah.
Anyway.
What a crazy time.
So
yeah.
we all figured out
watched
earlier
that.
that we watched that.
Yeah.
So that's what I've been doing. Oh, I watched Amy Schumer's comedy special, and I mellowed on her like a few, when she had her leather special. I was not that impressed, and she also is a little bit canceled. But I watched her most recent Netflix special, and it was pretty funny.
Nice.
So I'll give it like a 6.5 out of 10.
Ooh, 10-point scale.
6.5 out of 10.
A little drop.
Yeah,
a
I
little
don't
drop.
know that I'm interested in watching it. Like, Amy, she's fine.
She's fine. It was much funnier than the leather special
I didn't watch
and
that one.
anything else that she's done, honestly. So I thought it was funny. That's all.
For me, one of the things that I really enjoyed recently is I was getting into some African influenced music, and there was a thread on Indie Heads subreddit, and people were all like, oh, everybody that talks about African influenced music always talks about Paul Simon, and like there are actual African artists that are like African pop, or a lot of the originators, a lot of these styles that are getting essentially copied. And so I dove into a guy that I had learned about in my world music class in college, Fela Kuti, and his stuff is not only funky as hell and just incredible music. I started researching a lot into him and watched some documentaries on YouTube, and like a lot of people I feel like should know his stuff a lot more, because to me he seemed like he was what Bob Marley was to Jamaica, Fela Kuti was to Nigeria. And like his protest music was so powerful that it like actually pissed off the Nigerian government. I told Jamie about one of his albums, and it got talked about in one of the documentaries. It's called Zombie, and it was talking about the Nigerian army, and people were like using this song to make fun of the army, and they'd be like repeating stuff from it. It's just like 12-minute long, like funky jam, and the army went to his house and like destroyed everything, beat him up, threw his mom out a window, and she died. And then he like continued to make music after that and continued to protest, tried to run for president of Nigeria, and the government actively tried to shut it down, being like, we can't have more parties, like you can't create your own party and run for president, even though he was popular enough to do it. So it's super fascinating, and if you love like danceable music with a good message, Fela Kuti is the bomb. So I think that was a dope thing that I was getting into since the last episode.
Lots of things. I don't know. Let's see. Briefly, I did go down a rabbit hole of listening to Billie Eilish, because I work with teenagers and that's all they're talking about.
Oh, I've been doing that.
Yeah. And she fascinates me because she's 17 years old and is just absolutely insane, but like in a good way. So I've been listening to Billie Eilish. Let's see what else. Somehow neither of you mentioned Game of Thrones.
I mean it came on.
We were letting you.
Yeah, you got it.
Do it.
So as we record this, the first episode of season 8 of Game of Thrones came out last Sunday.
And so there's only 5 left, which is insane.
We
There's
all
only
have
5
watched
left?
it,
Mhm.
and we have a lot of feelings. That's what I'll say about that. I have a lot of feelings.
We have a lot of feelings about Bran.
About Bran.
Bran.
I also,
Just
though,
about-
just like for the record, I keep seeing things on Twitter about Sansa, and so many people hate Sansa. And you know what?
They hate her?
So many people.
That was only
love
justifiable
her.
in early seasons.
Yeah.
Sansa had flaws, but she was also young and like obviously
Right. She
was going
she
through
has
a lot.
the best character arc.
She has a great
does.
character arc in the show. I don't really understand that, but I don't know what the exact
But
problems
I also,
were.
Brian, you could confirm or deny this for me, because I was reading a Twitter thread about Sansa that I think was started by Hank Green, because Hank Green's he tweeted that he posted a video on his like side channel about Game of Thrones. And before he even realized what he was doing, he deleted a comment from somebody saying that Sansa is a useless character. He was just like, no, not that. But then I was reading all the comments on it, and somebody talked about how in the books, she's not the one that gets married to Ramsay. It's her friend.
Yeah.
And so she's just like chilling at the Vale when all this shit is happening.
And it hasn't developed that much either. So like maybe the plans would be that she's eventually going to, because like spoilers again to everybody, just fast forward like 3 minutes or so. Like Jon Snow hasn't even died yet in the books. Like there's still so much that hasn't happened that like I don't know, since George R.R. Martin has been a consultant on the show, if he was like, that's where we're gonna go with it, because there's a lot of discrepancies, but we still don't know what the end goal is going to be. But yeah, in the book,
because somebody was like defending the idea that Sansa sucks, and he was like, well, if you read the book, like she literally has no character arc. Like she's just sitting at the Vale and not hanging out with whatever.
But she'd still have, even with her influence at the Vale, like that is hugely important, or Jon Snow would die a second time. Like that's the whole freaking point.
I don't know the books.
Yeah.
So I didn't know. I haven't read the books.
On
our BookTube podcast, I haven't read the books for Game of Thrones.
I have to find a meme that I saw on, I don't know, you guys probably saw it. It was on Twitter, and it was just like, it was a quoted tweet of like another tweet, and it was like, Sansa Stark, like, all, you know, how about all these, you know, the greatest army in the world and dragons also, and then the quoted tweet just said, the budget is no.
Yeah, I saw that.
And the no is capitalized, which makes it funnier. I don't know. Just the budget is no.
I saw that.
I think she's great. She's one of my faves.
I love Sansa so much. Yeah, that's about it. I don't know. Yeah. I've done other things, but Brian's telling me that my time is up. So.
It's been a while, but we also have a book here we're getting into.
We also didn't introduce ourselves or talk about our drinks.
Yeah, I know. We're just kind of hopped into it.
Brian doesn't know how to run this podcast.
The pregame, guys. The pregame changed things.
The pregame tacos really did it. I'm Danny. I'm drinking a Michelob Ultra, and I'm ashamed about it.
I like how it was the pregame tacos are what caused this issue.
I would like to clarify, though, that that Michelob Ultra has been sitting in our fridge for over a year.
I am doing them
Danny's
a favor.
Doing us a favor.
One of our friends left it here, and we don't want to drink it. So
yeah. So instead, I'm Brian, and I'm drinking one of the Guinness from that 6-pack from our last episode.
Oh my god, it was a month ago.
Yeah, because of St. Patty's.
I'm Jamie. Hi, I'm drinking a Tank 7 Boulevard Brewing Company, but also I would like to also clarify that prior to these beers, Danny and I both had a rum drink called the Orgasm.
4 shots of rum.
Yeah, with like a lot of rum in it. So
it tasted like a beachy smoothie.
Yeah, it was like coconut and raspberry and other things. It was great. So
yeah, well, that's the beginning. Thanks for getting to know us again, since it's been over a month. Yeah, we're gonna hop into this. Danny's been going ham on these notes over here for the second part of 100 Years of Solitude.
I gotta take a lot of notes. I've had to take lots of notes on this whole book. I mean, this has been the most homeworky section of this podcast for me, which has been good. It's been like, you know, pre-AP English. It feels like I'm a freshman in high school again.
Well, after reading into it, you could feel the significance of it, because obviously there's like the reputation precedes it, but like there's just so much about this book that makes it feel I suppose elevated over, you know, other books that you may read.
Yeah, so we left off around page 203, at least in our editions of this book, just about halfway through, and in the second half, I'm just going to go through the list of things that I wrote down as a summary of the second half, because so many things happen and so many people die. I think I dog-eared the pages of whenever people die, and I was just dog-earing left and right for a little while. Just
Yes. They would happen so suddenly.
Yeah,
There was such a random death.
the first half is so much character development about so many characters, and then all of a sudden they just all kind of not
Just,
all
like,
at once,
don't
but
hear
like
about
you
them
just
anymore.
don't. Yeah, and then it's like, oh, and Ursula was a billion years old, and or
Well, we go from deaths that are like
Rebecca buried herself alive.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we go from deaths that are
Amaranta
like
was knitting
really
her own shroud.
like ceremonial at the end of chapters, and
Right.
then all of a sudden we get deaths where it's just like in the middle. It's like, oh yeah, P.S.
I thought
somebody else went.
I thought that was interesting that they did that. It almost was like it was almost like we divided it in half a little bit arbitrarily, but it felt very much like the first half was like
Yeah.
ceremonious deaths like at the ends of chapters, and then in this it was just like death after death, and some of them were like Colonel Aureliano Buendia dies very like he just kind of fades into nothingness, right?
Mm-hmm.
He just kind of like falls asleep and dies. So that's one of the things that happens in the second half.
Yeah. We'll
So-
we'll just do like this brief summary, I suppose. Whatever you can do.
Yeah, so it starts out with I liked this. Ursula going blind, and it talks about how she's very blind, but she just knows she's so old and so experienced with like the town and her family that she knows what's going on at all times because she just knows everybody's routines. So she finds things that are lost better than anybody else, despite being the only person in the city, or like she's very old and very blind. Aureliano Segundo is still having an affair with Petra. Is it Cortez or Cortez? I can't remember. I think it's Cortez.
I think it's Cotes, and I kept thinking of Coates.
Coates.
But obviously it's not that. But I'm just
Petra
saying.
Coates.
Yeah. Petra Coates.
So Aureliano Segundo and Petra Cortez are having an affair whilst he is still married to like the cold and aggressively religious Fernanda,
Oh my god.
who is just a lot.
As a presence in
She's
this back
just kind
half.
of like a religious slave driver and like takes over the house and just makes it very much she just is, I don't know, she's just a very cold character the whole time, the whole rest of the book. One of the biggest events that happens in the second half is Jose Arcadio Segundo. He is organizing a group of people for a strike, a workers' strike, and it's basically the government agrees to meet with them, and it's basically a setup. They station, people with guns all around, and end up basically massacring thousands of men, women, and children. And Jose Arcadio Segundo wakes up on a train, taking all of these corpses out of the city, and he realizes what's happened, and makes his way back to Macondo, and to his horror, nobody remembers what happened. And then at that point, there's like a symbolic rain. I don't remember if it starts then or if it's already been happening. But there's
I think it starts after the massacre.
Yeah, because
I mean, like when he gets back to Macondo?
Yeah.
And then there's this very symbolic rain that just like washes all evidence of the massacre. It lasts forever, like 5 years or something.
Yeah, 4 or 5. Yeah.
Washes all evidence of the massacre, and then everybody's minds have been washed of what happened. And so there are times in the second half of the book that he brings it up and other people bring it up, and it's like there are two sides. There's the people who remember it happening or heard about it happening and believe that it happened, and then the people that think that it's a hoax, basically.
And that's based off of a real event.
Yes.
Which we'll talk about, I'm sure.
There's a lot of other things that happen, but that's the most important part, I would say.
Yeah, and then the eventual
The discovery of Melquiades' text again.
yeah, basically
or the translation of it.
which is a prediction of the family dissolving and Macondo being wiped away. So
yeah, disappearing.
it all gets built up at the beginning and gets swept away at the end. So yeah,
That's
that's the book. We're done.
That's
ASMR baby.
Can I ask a question before I forget it?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I remember it now. I thought of it
That's okay.
while you were talking. Okay, no, right at the beginning of your summary, you talked about how we divided the book kind of arbitrarily between like first half and second half. But it felt different.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was a transition there. Specifically talking about death. And I know that in the first half, I don't remember that we really mentioned this. I think we did briefly. But in the first half of the novel, there's like this idea that Macondo is really perfect and lovely and literally no one dies until outsiders come in.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if you guys noticed, I don't know that I did. I would need to think back to it, but is there like an inciting incident like that leads to a bunch of people dying, or like is there a change
In the first half, you mean?
Like when we get into the second half, when it seems like everybody's just dying without cause, is there a noticeable change before that?
Good question.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm trying to remember who died first though.
Yeah,
because so many people did.
Yeah. I don't know.
Well, there's Aureliano Triste. I forgot about him. I mean, there's like forgotten about
dozens of Aurelianos.
Let me just see if I can quickly find like one of my dog ears of when people died. But I mean,
it wasn't Jose Arcadio Buendia, was it?
I don't think so.
I don't remember. I think that we would remember if there was like an inciting incident that started like all the deaths of people.
Yeah. I don't know. I feel like the first time I read it, I didn't notice that like, oh, the town was perfect until outsiders came in. Mm-hmm. Like, I don't know that I like acknowledged that. And so I just a thought, a question to ponder.
I mean, I think that
there's something
that's part of
else.
It. Like capitalism
if it's just like running off of that. When does the train come in?
Yeah, I was thinking about the train and capitalism.
It's right about when we stopped.
Yeah.
Or I think it was right after, because I remember we started learning about Mr. Brown, and he came in to have a banana and then was like, hey, this is the spot, y'all.
This is the spot.
That's a direct quote if you look at page 243.
Don't go there.
But I think that was definitely an acceleration, though.
Yeah.
Like, as much as, there may have been deaths earlier, I think that, that was an acceleration, obviously, because that was such a monumental change for the town.
Yeah.
And previous to that, like, there were outsiders with the gypsies and whatnot, but everything was still young and fresh, and there hadn't been a whole lot of what is the word I'm trying to think of? Just a buildup of continuous like sin and wrongdoing with the family. Because I think that was like something that I was starting to realize about, especially as we got to the end of the novel. That like I think misfortunes continued because the family continued to do things that were like quote unquote wrong, like continuing to interbreed with their own family, because we literally get to the end of the family line, and this whole time has been a warning from Ursula talking about, hey, I'm worried about marrying Jose Arcadio Buendia because rumor has it a child will be born with a pigtail. And that's how the family ends, with the baby with a pigtail. And
they talk about it for so long. She freaks out about it for the whole book, and then finally that's how it like ends.
Yeah, and they all have such and as the family line grows, because you think of like, at the beginning we're learning about the first 3 children getting born and the issues that stem from that, because even from the earliest generation with Jose Arcadio at the very beginning, it continues to build from there, because there are more of the family there to continue their sins and to kind of like bring more misfortune as time goes on. So I don't know if there was an inciting fact, except for the fact that more people had more time to do more egregious
and
acts.
that's kind of what Melquiades like prophecy says, is that they're just gonna keep fucking themselves over.
Like,
and-
it's just going to be a cycle.
Yeah, and then once they learn about it, they can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
Pretty much.
It's not very hopeful.
No, it's not. I wouldn't call it a hopeful
It's
novel.
not hopeful.
I would not call it a hopeful novel.
Okay, I just have a few questions that I thought were interesting. So one of them just has to do with the way that religion is presented in the book, because there are so many. There are like a few like priests. There's Fernanda, who is like kind of like laying down the law, like religious woman. And then there's also I wondered if you guys had any thoughts about this essay question that I was like looking at. Mentions to pay close attention to Aureliano, the illegitimate son of Meme and Mauricio Babilionia. Meme is the one who went and met the guy, and they were like having an affair, and I think Fernanda found out. Somebody found out and like had him shot.
Yeah, Fernanda found out.
And
yeah.
Meme had the baby and sent it back to Fernanda, and she raised it and named it Aureliano for some reason. But I wondered why. I mean, I guess I wondered why that question would have said pay close attention to that Aureliano in the context of religion. I guess maybe because it's an illegitimate child, but there were a lot of those throughout the novel.
Yeah,
I don't know. I don't know if
strange.
you had any thoughts.
The only parallel I could see is just like in an opposite way of like the anti-Moses, because like it's a child that was sent along back to a family, but instead of saving his people, he is indirectly ending his line, because that seems very harsh to put on his shoulders, obviously, but he did have another relationship with his aunt Amaranta to birth the last child, and the prophecy essentially like says or alludes to the fact that he's the one that ends the line by reading the prophecy itself. So it seems to be like an anti-Moses.
Wait, so Aureliano's the one who had the baby who died, right? The baby at the end who dies. So,
yeah, he is.
That's interesting.
So that's why I find it weird that if there was an essay question regarding that, it seems to be, unless there's a story that I'm unaware of, like I see the parallels as far as like the baby is brought back.
Well, they talk about that though. They talk about Aureliano in the context of, they don't say Moses, but they say something about like his I think they called his origin story. They said his origin story was being found in a basket.
Yeah, it was.
That's like what they talk. That's so like there's a Moses parallel there.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying is it just seems like the opposite Moses.
It's the opposite, the anti-Moses.
The anti-Moses, yeah.
No, you're right. That's really interesting.
And I don't know that any of the religious parallels as far as like any of the good aspects are really even present to me.
Yeah.
Because it seems like there are a lot of instances where the family tries to right some wrong within the line by either sending their children off to various religious institutions to no avail.
Like Meme went to...
She was supposed to be a nun.
Yeah.
And like even instances in the town where like churches were built up, or there was the one particular church with who was that Italian guy?
Fernando? Is that his name?
Crespi? Something Crespi.
I thought that was his first name.
Pietro?
Pietro.
Pietro Crespi. And like even in those instances, like that his relationship with the family was fraught, and he was like a religious based guy. It just never seemed like any of those instances where they were trying to intertwine themselves with religious institutions even led to any salvation at all. Which I found interesting because we're talking about how there's not a lot of hope in the book. Like, it doesn't seem like anybody is saved unless we count Remedios the beauty, had she happened to ascend into
She's
heaven,
the one who floated up to
or
heaven,
whatever,
right?
whatever
happened.
whatever happened to her.
Just
Yeah,
no
Yeah, I don't know. I
explanation.
guess it's just I was reading a bit about just I don't know, just thoughts on religion related to this book, and I feel like in a lot of books like this, authors are pretty not overt, but like it's pretty obvious, you can tell the author's feelings on religion.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like in this case you can very obviously tell his feelings on like fraught politics and like the politics of the country, but I feel like the way he feels about religion is kind of a toss-up. Like, he's not disparaging it, but he's also not praising it by any means.
No, because it's not like
he's kind of making fun of it, but like not. But then also like half of the book, most of the book is like, oh, and then there was a ghost, and then they talked to so and so. So it's not like it has any like. There's no question about like oh, it doesn't make any sense. It's not realistic or whatever. Like, there's no question about religion being unrealistic.
Yeah, and they want it to be used in a positive way. It's never like, people were actively disparaging religion. It was still something that they were like wanting to use to, turn the family around. Because I think that most of the Buendias were aware that their family had some issues
Going
throughout time,
downhill.
and they tried, especially in the later generations, there seemed to be an even more of an emphasis on getting the children involved in these religious institutions to try to help. And I just think that the Buendias themselves were the problem, and maybe not the religion in this case.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also think that like it looking in the context of like South American literature and South American culture, and I don't know everything about it, so I'm not gonna like say a ton, but
Nothing.
I mean, I do know that like it's South American culture, like religion is important. Like it's a like very like strong religious culture. But also I think that relationship is kind of fraught, because I feel like a lot of South America, that maybe I'm wrong, I feel like a good amount of South America is Catholic.
Yeah, I would.
And that's like from colonialism. Like that's not. And so like I feel like the relationship is fraught because they do feel like close to God, or like feel like religion is valid and that so many people trust that, but also it was brought in by people that they don't trust.
That actually is an interesting point, because of the fact that, from our own readings, obviously it's easy to see, but also when looking at any analyzation of the book, like a huge part of the themes of the book is about colonialism and how that affects the native cultures, especially, in a microcosm here in Macondo. But that is interesting to see that relationship with religion in this case because of its origins in the region.
And especially like we're dealing with in Macondo in this section, like not classic colonialism. Like it's not like Spain took over and is running. Like it's a word that I relearned today, neocolonialism. That's like capitalism colonialism. Like it's like businesses coming in and essentially running the town. So that like has less to do with religion, which I also feel like is why he focuses on it less, maybe because he saw.
Well, that happens in the second half of. I mean, it's definitely less focused on in the second half of the book.
Yeah,
when capitalism kind of takes precedence.
I feel like he sees more of an effect from those people, like from capitalist measures rather than religious measures, with the fruit company and everything. I don't know. Also, I would like to just say that I opened up the book to a random page while we were talking about this, and the first quote I saw was from Colonel Orellano Buendia, I think. Yeah. He said, "That's all we need," he muttered. "A pope."
Well, then there's somebody, one of the older women in the family is, and that is where we'll conclude. One of the older women.
We solved the book.
It's Amaranta or Ursula or something, and she's obsessed with Jose Arcadio Segundo, I think, becoming pope, right?
Well, Jose Arcadio goes
There
to
are a
the
couple instances.
seminary. That's what's happening
Right,
right
so
here.
that's-
There are
okay,
a
so
couple.
that's what
there are a
that
couple
is.
family members that they're the older members of the generation are trying to actively move them toward being a pope. Notably, Ursula, in a lot of cases. But as far as the focus on capitalism and its effect, the interesting part of that in thinking about the arc of the story and the arc of the book and the fact that we have noticed some shift in the middle because of how we stopped at where we did. It does seem like there is maybe not a narrative climax, but a climax of some sort. Wilford agrees. A climax of some sort within the actual building of the town, because everything is expanding with the railroad, with the actual company, with all of these people coming into the town that we're building and building and building. And when we're in the middle and the massacre happens, that's when the rains start. And that is a huge precursor to a lot of the rest of the degradation of the town and the misery of the town. And that's all brought on. Presumably the rain is brought on from this terrible deed from the company. And so that's like
like flooding like that is such a biblical image.
Yeah,
Like,
of cleansing everything.
Yeah.
And
But it shows the importance of, where the focuses are, because though, we're mentioning a lot about the religious imagery, like it is important to kind of see that was part of the climax of the town itself. Again, maybe not the narrative climax, but the climax of the town itself and its decline after their terrible act.
Mm-hmm.
that brings me nicely into my next question.
segue.
That was an unplanned segue.
ASMR, baby.
So I read this a few weeks ago when I first started the second half of the book. And I was confused about it. So it talks about analyzing the Banana Massacre scene. And then, it asks how do we know that the Banana Massacre scene is the climactic scene of the book? And I underlined that part because I was kind of like, well, I don't think we do know. Like, I mean, I think that it is I think you could make arguments for a lot of places being I don't know if there's like a definitive climax in this situation. I think there's maybe a few, but I think it definitely delineates the beginning of the end. And so I think maybe that's what makes it the climax. But I just thought that was interesting because I had to do a little more digging to because I mean the massacre itself is only 2 pages long. It doesn't last very long. It's not. It's. I mean, there's whole pages of people having an inner dialogue longer than this massacre happening.
That made it more shocking to me and made me almost be like, did that really happen, because of how
Yeah.
short it was. I was questioning it for a while.
Which is a nice parallel to how everybody else reacts to it.
Yeah.
In the novel.
Because I honestly
Right,
didn't
and
know.
it was 2
I
pages
honestly
later,
didn't
and
know.
I had to go back and read it. I read it at least twice. I just
Yeah.
needed to kind of, I don't know, debrief on what actually happened. So I don't know. I mean, we can talk more about that, but I just thought that was interesting an interesting question about it's similar to the question that I asked last week of, who do we think the hero is? I think that you can make a lot of, a lot of arguments for
the climax.
the climax of this book.
But also, I don't know, you noted it as the beginning of the end, which I do think that's
Which
valid.
is the definition of a climax. I mean,
that is I give my students a nice little
it's a little thing.
that's
So I guess that's
story
what.
structure. So I would call that the climax. But I do agree that it's almost anticlimactic in how short it is.
Mm-hmm.
There's not.
I guess it wasn't as obvious to
Yeah.
me until I kept reading, which is interesting because I feel like sometimes you get to the climax of a book and you're like, this is it. This is the
Yeah, you're
this
like
is the
on
time,
the
and everybody
edge of your
it
seat.
lasts for pages and it's great.
Yeah.
But I feel like I had to keep reading to compare it to the rest of the book to actually understand that that's what it was.
Well, it did stick out regardless. Like, it wasn't something that you could pass over because, like,
Right.
immediately upon reading it, like, it was such a horrifying thing, whether it was a hallucination or not. It was just the way it's described and the way it was just so mercilessly done. Like, you know, that was something that I continued to read on, and it does continue to get, you know, referenced back to. But, you know, I think that kind of aids the argument, like maybe it was well done and how short it was, because regardless, like, it's hard to sugarcoat, you know, something as massive of like 3,000 people were wiped out in one fell swoop. Like, you could say it in that few of, you know, of terms, and it would still carry an impact because of the implication of what happens. And so, like, I think that, you know, it's hard to say otherwise that it's not. I just think that there are a lot of, like, aspects later on that kind of seal the deal for the story of the family. So that's what I'm saying as far as the narrative arc for the family, but probably for the overall story of Macondo itself, that, yeah, I would argue that probably was. But it's just crazy to think of, like, how much of a long fall there is afterward, which I think is a big part of this story. Like, it does really hit you harder about the fall of the family because it does take so long, because it is such a long, like, there's so many people to die, there's so many buildings to fall. And so I think it is kind of important that it does happen where it does, to allow that time to allocate as much time to the building of the town and the family and the fall of the town and the family.
I also think that similarly, it could be considered the climax just because so much is leading up to, like, the idea of foreigners bringing bad things in.
Yeah.
Like, there's, like, they call it, like, the rash of the foreigners. Like, and I think that is the climax of that conflict throughout the novel.
Yeah.
Also, like, the banana company comes in and everything starts being more obvious, like how detrimental it is to the natives of the land. So even outside of the family, like, that is the climax of that plot line. Colonialism and neo-colonialism. Big word. Also, I had, like, a flashback while you guys were sitting here talking about this, like, very vivid flashback to when I took the class that I read this for. Of I think I had to write, like, a page analysis or something over the banana massacre for the class, and I just had, like, war flashbacks to me sitting there being like, it's only 2 pages. How am I gonna like?
What am I supposed to
Where is
say?
more information on this? Like, I don't know what to say.
Yeah. You know, I mean, right. You have to, like, keep reading to be able to analyze it more, almost. Okay, I have one last question, and I want to read it word for word from this, like, study guide that I found, because it starts out in a funny way. It starts, incest is usually a remote possibility for families.
Usually.
I just feel like that's kind of an understatement. But I feel like also it was an unnecessary introduction to this question about incest. Like, we don't need an explanation about incest and how it doesn't
And
happen.
its possibilities.
For the Buendias, it is a constant threat.
Oh.
Why?
I don't think that they see it as a threat. I feel like.
Yeah, but so what is it about the Buendia family and their solitude that makes incest such a danger? This is the bias of whoever wrote this essay question coming through. But I think that's interesting because I don't necessarily, you're right, I don't think that they think it's a danger. Only one of them really thinks that it's dangerous, and it doesn't happen.
The rest of them are kind of just like.
They're all just kind of like banging who they want to bang.
Well, some of them don't know, first of all. Some of them
That's true.
feel remorse on it later.
And then also some of them think that they're related and then find out that they're not. Like with Rebecca, they thought that Rebecca was like their sister, right? And then she marries.
Well, the later generation does.
Well, Ursula's still pretty pissed about it because she's the one that's like, she's your sister, regardless of the fact that she's adopted. Because Ursula's the one that's like, hey, what the, come on.
Speaking of incest, Game of Thrones.
Nice.
That's bringing it back.
That's the commentary
Callback.
we're looking for.
Classic callback.
I don't know. I think that the danger of it is, first of all, a normalization. It's already happened from the beginning. And just the fact that, again, the family gets spread so wide that it's hard to always know. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a lot of presence to the characters that, it's easy to get drawn to people that have such influence the way that they do, and they had such a role in the town, and they're always there. Like, people come and go, it seems, but the Buendias always have a presence from beginning to end. And I just think that also, I keep going back to this theory just because, now I've read the end of the book and see how it all kind of sums up. But I think that there is almost a curse on the family from the beginning because of that initial incestual relationship. Mm-hmm. And that, we start getting into this theme about the cyclical nature of time and how all of the similarly named characters have similar traits. They seem to make similar mistakes. And I that's not happening worldwide, obviously. We're talking about the banana company coming in and out. There's not a lot of other evidence of other places around the world suffering similar fates. That I think that to me is a huge part of the story, is that, we learn about this curse and it culminates at the end of the story with, though it is a simple thing, the pigtail appearing on the last Aureliano. And so I think that's, just it comes with the territory. It's something that's inescapable. Once that starts, they've already broken this barrier that they shouldn't have. That's just the fate of the family, and that's just the way that it is.
I feel like incest is also an interesting way to try to illustrate the cyclical nature of this family. Like, it's kind of like a literal representation of
literal cycle.
Yeah, I feel like the family is incestuous in more ways than one. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but do you know what I mean? Like the whole thing is about how it's like a cycle, how it's like a circle, how things are repeating themselves, and you're here you are marrying and making babies with your own family. You're repeating parts of your own family closer than they should be. Yeah. And so I don't know. I feel like it's him using incest as a way to illustrate again the cyclical nature of the family.
Yeah. And it makes sense because when you talk about how much the characters are similar to one another, there's not a lot of deviation from that gene pool, am I right?
So right. That caught me off guard. Am I right? It caught me off guard.
So I mean, it is. It is definitely. When you say it like that, it is used as a tool for sure. Because
there's no deviation from that gene pool in any sense of the word.
And so it does help illustrate it in a physical form of the family, because you're directly implanting these character traits into your own family to continue the cycle. Mm-hmm. They're not trying to have other genes in the pool to help them deviate away from these issues. Because they are issues they keep talking about over and over, despite the fact that a lot of the Jose Arcadios and the Aurelianos have noble traits. they also have significant problems. And it just happens to be that those men stay in the family.
Have a
So to
thing
speak.
for their cousins.
So I don't know about the danger, but I just think that it's just bound to happen. The way that the story is structured, it just seems like that's just kind of part of the curse of the Buendias.
Mm-hmm. The curse of the Buendias.
Alternate title.
It's not as catchy.
You're right.
As
You're right.
capitalism /RR. Oh no, you mean the title of the book?
Yeah.
Not the title of the episode.
Capitalism are bananas.
Bananas. That's what it's about. Do you guys have any final thoughts? I have one more question, but
Okay, I can talk. I don't know.
I was just
Brian just
we
pointed
can
at me.
tie this into my final
I'm
question
just
too.
saying, do you want me to?
But like, I'm gonna ask a very just basic. Did you like it? Like, let's talk about if we liked it
Yeah,
and how we liked it.
I do still really love this book, but it is not a book that I would read just casually for pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is the second time I've read it, and both times it has been like a homework assignment.
Right.
Like, I mean, our book club podcast is very fun, and I'm doing it.
How convincing.
I'm doing it willingly, but
We forced her into this
but
one.
it still feels like homework.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
when I
it does.
am
Oh, it felt like homework to me every
Yeah.
night when I
Yeah.
had to
Danny
read
over here
20
with her-
pages.
and
with
I
my
don't
Question sheet notes.
like. I think it would be really hard for me to read this book without that motivation. But
Yes.
I enjoy it, and I think that it's really valuable, and I like thinking, like I like learning about the context of it, and understanding why it is this way and why it's important and why Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a genius, because I do I think it's insane that this book exists.
I think it's amazing that anybody was able to write
Yeah.
and make sense of his own, like, of all of this. Like, he made sense of it.
Yeah, and it's fascinating, and it's a different style of book than I would normally read. But that's my thought, is that, like, I really love it, and I feel like I will always tell people, like, oh, that's a book that you really should read, but also I wouldn't just, like, bring this to the beach. It's not a beach read.
Oh, no.
So those
I
are
need my
thoughts.
computer and my notes
Yeah.
and my pencil.
Yeah. Those are my thoughts.
To start off, really liked it. This is definitely my style of book.
Brian would take this to the beach.
I would take this to the beach and read. This is a book that, for the first time in a while, like with a lot of the other books in our podcast, like I took active notes and looked up a lot along the way, and I just kind of let this one flow. I feel like the world building, which is kind of funny to say because it's not, typically associated outside of fantasy novels or high fantasy novels, but I felt like the world building in this novel was spectacular. There was a lot of, you could picture Macondo, and a lot of the descriptions of the family, even the character building amongst them, it was very well done, especially when you started to realize the cyclical nature of the characters, because even though it's spread quite far within the family tree, we're getting 7 generations here, because there's some order to the characters, it did kind of bring it back into an easier to understand package. And I've talked before on the podcast that endings of books can be, huge for me. They can affect my enjoyment just from how it wraps up. I loved this ending. I thought it was amazing to have the story of the family end with the last character reading the fate of the family and he presumably dies when he's done reading, and just to kind of encapsulate, these 100 years of this family so perfectly, and kind of see where it was going the whole time, because it did get confusing for a while. There's a lot of characters and you don't realize those themes right away, but I think the way it ends really makes the book make more sense to me, and I would like to read it again to start catching those parallels earlier. But yeah, I thought it was a masterwork to me, and I really, really enjoyed it.
I'd like it to go on record that I told Brian he would love this book, and that it was his kind of book.
I don't think there's any question that this is Brian's kind of book.
I know, but I just, I told him for years. I feel like I kept
For 100 years.
There were 100 years of me telling Brian he needs to read Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Yeah, I liked it a lot.
This book was 100 years of solitude of me trying to read it.
Wow.
Not in a bad way. This is not my this is not the kind of book that I gravitate toward. But I enjoyed it. I think that it's, again, not a book that I would take to the beach. This is the kind of book I really enjoyed diving into and annotating and getting several study guides and taking lots of notes and trying to figuring out what's going on and parsing through it in that way. I did really enjoy it. It's the kind of thing that I feel like I always wanted to do in AP English, but never actually had time to do. We were supposed to annotate, but I never felt like I had time to really digest because we were reading so much. And so I mean, this is the kind of nerdy stuff that I like to do. That I like to when I read a book that I'm not understanding or that is kind of going over my head. But it's also for me kind of a lesson in I feel like the grit in me just wants to finish any and every book that I start, regardless of whether or not I'm liking it. So I don't think that I would have stopped reading it if, I wasn't reading it for this podcast. But I do think that there were points where I was I don't remember what's going on. I'm just going to keep powering through because I need to remember what's happening and I need to familiarize myself with Macondo again.
Yeah, and trying to go back, there's just so much.
Well, and that's the thing. You can just open the book. I feel cyclically speaking, you can just open the book at any point, and the book could start on any page at any time.
It's so dense. The book feels a lot longer than it actually is because it's so dense and doesn't stick in a linear.
So much happens.
Yeah,
in a page.
This book didn't feel like so a 400-page book, and so the exhaustion is definitely.
Well, and even visually, the blocks of text are long.
Yeah, you don't have short paragraphs.
Most of the book is. There's 1 to 2 paragraphs on every page, and that's it for long stretches of the book. And I kept calling this.
Danny found Santa stamps in
I
her
found
book.
Santa stamps in my book. What was I gonna say? Gosh darn it. Yeah, I don't know. I think that you could open the book at any point, and I think that speaks to the cyclical nature of it, and how you could start at any point and just go from there all the way back through the end to the beginning again to that point, and it would kind of be the same. You're just opening the book, you're getting a glimpse of what it's like in Macondo and kind of the timelessness of the town as well. And so I definitely enjoyed it, but I kept calling it every time. I feel like every time I finished, a chunk of pages, I called it exhausting. I was exhausted. I was mentally drained and exhausted after reading it, after trying to parse through what was happening, remember the characters, remember who had which traits and when they switched back. I feel like that was just it was so much for me.
We're looking at you, Segundo boys.
Yeah, the Segundos and man. But yeah, it was exhausting in a good way. It was like mentally, I don't know, stimulating, and it was good. I'm glad that it's one of those books that I'm glad to have read. I think I said that about Hitchhiker's Guide, but it's one of those books that I'm glad to have read.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a book that makes me want to read his other books that are shorter, and I know Brian has read one of the shorter ones.
150 pages.
And I think,
Short and
honestly,
sweet.
I think that I would like those. I don't want to say better, because I think that this is such an important work, but I feel like I would enjoy the reading process more of like still having his writing style and the magical realism and
Yeah.
everything.
I will say for the one that I read, I believe it's called Of Love and Other Demons.
Yeah.
It after reading this, it reminds me of this book if we were focusing on like one storyline.
Yeah, like one couple or something.
Yeah. But it's got a similar vibe for sure, and the chunks of text are similar, but the story wraps up a lot faster and it's a lot more succinct, and I think that it is worth checking out just because it's of how short it is. But yeah, I definitely want to check out more of his work as well.
Yeah, I definitely want to read Chronicle of a Death Foretold, because that's the one he wrote right before he won the Nobel Prize. And I don't know a lot about that book. Also unrelated, but on the back of my book, unlike your hardcovers over there, the last book that he wrote, according to this, it says his most recent book is the novel Memories of My Melancholy Whores. So I would like to read that.
Oh man, I want to read that immediately.
Curiosity.
I want to know what that's about.
I like the phrase melancholy whores.
I think that fits really well. But
You
yeah.
mean you or?
I just, in general, I think that whores are melancholy. This has been Brian's Book Bastion.
That is where we'll end our show today.
Yes. So that's another book off the list.
Are you announcing what's next? Or
Yeah.
are we keeping that under wraps?
Yeah, we're gonna go ahead and do that. So we did talk about the.
I don't even know.
Yeah.
I don't remember which one we picked.
So we had talked about last episode about what we're going to be doing, kind of as a dividing couple episodes, because our original plan was to get 7 books read in this podcast. We may continue afterward, but that's just our minimum goal here. And so we've each led one book now.
I'm fully planning on keeping this up for the rest of our
lives
Yeah.
forever and ever. So we've done 3 books, and each of us has led one, and then we're going to do one in the middle where we're going to bring in a 4th person.
Our friend Andrew.
Yeah, Andrew.
Andrew,
by saying
listen
his
immediately.
name, that means
It's
he's
committed.
to being on the podcast.
We also mentioned that it was going to be a Kurt Vonnegut book, and so we're going to start reading Bluebeard.
Okay.
I
couldn't remember if it was Galapagos or Bluebeard.
Yeah, we're going to start reading Bluebeard. We're going to text Andrew soon, and we'll be back with that with those episodes soon as well. So we hope you stick with it, and then once we get to the end of those episodes, we'll have a new batch of 3 books that each of us will be leading, and we'll see where it goes from there. But yeah, this has been our episode, or our 2 episodes on 100 Years of Solitude.
Bye.
That's it. We're just leaving right there.
Bye.
Bye.
Bop. Bye.